Clara and Harold Johnson seemed like the perfect couple, quiet, reliable and well-liked in the small town of Ashwood. But behind their picture-perfect facade, they were hiding a dark, unspeakable secret. Their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, would vanish without a trace, and the shocking truth of what had been happening behind their closed doors would stun the entire town. What had truly happened to Lily? And how had her parents managed to conceal the most horrifying crime Ashwood would ever know? Ashwood was the kind of town where nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, it had the charm of a place frozen in time. The town was small, barely a few hundred residents, and everyone knew everyone else. It was the type of place where people left their front doors unlocked. Children played freely in the streets, until the sun dipped below the horizon and neighbors exchanged pleasantries over the picket fences that separated their homes. The pace of life in Ashwood was slow, comfortable, and above all, predictable. The Johnsons were a part of that predictable, quiet life. Harold, the father, was a burly man in his 30s, known for his hard work as a construction contractor. He wasn't much of a talker, but he had a quiet dignity about him that earned him the respect of his peers. His wife, Clara, was a homemaker, the type of woman who always kept her house immaculate, her children's clothes pressed, and her garden blooming. They were a picture-perfect couple, often seen at the local grocery store picking up a loaf of bread or chatting briefly with neighbors about the weather. To outsiders, they were just another hard-working, middle-class family trying to get by. Their daughter, Lily, was a 7-year-old girl with the kind of innocence that only children possess. Her big brown eyes shone with curiosity, and her small frame was often seen riding her bike around the block or playing with friends in the park. Lily was quiet, with a sweet disposition, but she had an undeniable energy about her. She was well-liked in the town, always polite, always with a smile on her face. Everyone knew Lily, but no one thought to dig deeper into the Johnsons' life. They were the kind of family that blended into the background, never causing any trouble, always keeping to themselves. But there was something about the Johnsons that didn't sit quite right, something that was difficult to put a finger on. They were too perfect, too normal. They never seemed to struggle, never seemed to have issues like the other families in town. They were the kind of family people admired, but they were also the kind of family people didn't truly know. Neighbors often commented that while the Johnsons were friendly, they kept to themselves more than most. Their home was always eerily quiet, even when it shouldn't have been. It wasn't unusual for children to disappear from time to time, running off to play with friends or wandering off to explore the woods. But when Lily didn't return home, one evening there was a sudden shift in the air. At first the town took it in stride. "She's just playing too long," they told themselves. But as the hours ticked by and the sun sank lower in the sky, the uncertainty began to creep in. Harold and Clara were seen walking down the street, searching for their daughter, their faces tense with worry. But it wasn't the panic one might expect. There was something strange in their demeanor. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't desperate, it was almost controlled. Clara's eyes were dry, her movements deliberate. Harold seemed distant, like his thoughts were somewhere far away, detached from the present moment. When the police arrived to help, they were quick to organize a search, but something about the whole situation felt off. It was as if everyone in the town knew there was a problem, but no one could say what it was. As the night wore on, the usual sense of calm in Ashwood faded. Something had happened to Lily, and no one knew where she was, or what had happened to her. The search continued through the night, but every hour that passed without a sign of the little girl made it more and more clear that this wasn't a simple case of a child wandering too far from home. And for the first time, Ashwood began to wonder what could be hiding behind the quiet, perfect facade of the Johnson family. The disappearance of Lily Johnson quickly became the talk of Ashwood. In the days following her vanishing, the small town was filled with whispers and questions. At first, people assumed she had simply wandered off, perhaps to the nearby woods, or the old creek where children often played. It wasn't uncommon for kids to go missing for a few hours, only to show up, covered in dirt and scratches, claiming they had gotten lost while exploring. But as time passed, and there was still no sign of Lily, the mood in Ashwood began to shift. Concern turned to fear, and fear began to stir the quiet, peaceful rhythms of the town. Harold and Clara were everywhere, joining search parties, helping the local police and speaking to news reporters. On the outside, they appeared every bit. The worried parents, frantic, exhausted, and desperate for their daughter's safe return. Harold's large hands gripped his hat tightly as he stood outside the police station, his face a mask of anxiety. Clara, usually calm and composed, looked as though she had aged years in just a few days. She was constantly seen clutching her coat tightly around her, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. But there was something about their behavior that seemed to ring false. Their grief was too controlled, their worry too carefully measured. The townspeople began to notice small, unsettling details. Neighbours who had once seen Harold walking down the street with Lily now saw him alone, his gaze distant, as if he was looking through everything and everyone around him. Clara, who had always been the picture of maternal devotion, now seemed distant. She answered questions from the police with short, almost rehearsed responses, and when people tried to offer comfort, her eyes never seemed to meet theirs. The Johnsons. Home had always been an open, welcoming place to neighbours, but after Lily's disappearance, the door remained closed. Clara hadn't been seen baking her famous pies or tending to her garden, and Harold was no longer seen taking his usual strolls in the evening. It was as though the house itself had become a fortress, shuttered and dark, holding in some terrible secret. The police were not blind to the strange behaviour of the Johnsons. They had initially treated the case like any other missing child case, innocent, unremarkable, and easily solvable. But as the days turned into weeks, they began to investigate the family more closely. They asked questions, subtly at first, testing the waters of the Johnsons' alibis. Harold had been at work when Lily disappeared, but Clara's whereabouts were far more difficult to verify. Then came the first real lead, an offhand comment from a neighbour who had seen Clara on the afternoon Lily vanished. The neighbour, who had been helping search the woods near the Johnsons' home, recalled seeing Clara standing by the front gate just before dusk. Clara had been acting strangely, standing still, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though she were holding something in. The neighbour, feeling uncomfortable by Clara's odd behaviour, had quickly moved on, not thinking much of it at the time. That evening, as the investigation continued, the police learned that Clara had been seen moving back and forth between the garage and the house, seemingly carrying something large and heavy in a large bag. Again, no one thought much of it, and it could have been something innocent, but the pieces were slowly beginning to fall into place. By the time the search party was called off, there was no sign of Lily, no footprints, no clothing, no trace of her ever having been there. The woods had been combed and the creek had been searched, yet nothing had turned up. The police, now increasingly suspicious of the Johnsons, dug deeper into their personal history. They interviewed old friends, family members, and colleagues. They discovered that Harold had never been particularly close to his daughter. In fact, he had never been the hands-on father that people assumed he was. Clara, too, had kept to herself for years, and the people closest to her had begun to speak of subtle signs of unease. Something had gone terribly wrong in the Johnson household, but what it was, no one knew yet. As the weeks dragged on, the police were left with more questions than answers. But in the back of their minds, one disturbing thought began to take root. Lily hadn't just wandered off. Someone knew exactly where she was. And that person was hiding something far worse than anyone in Ashwood could have imagined. As the days turned into weeks without a single sign of Lily, the people of Ashwood began to grow uneasy. What had started as a quiet search for a missing child had turned into a desperate, mounting frustration. The town's optimism that Lily would return safely began to dwindle, replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. The authorities, who had once treated the case as a routine missing person investigation, began to see the situation for what it really was. A mystery that wasn't about a lost child, but something far darker. Detectives assigned to the case began to re-examine every lead, every scrap of evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. Yet, despite their efforts, there was nothing to go on. Lily's bike had been found near the edge of the woods, abandoned, as though she had simply dropped it and walked away. No witnesses had seen anything unusual, no strange vehicles, no footprints, no sounds of distress. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Then, one evening, a breakthrough came, but not in the form anyone expected. A neighbour, an older woman named Margaret, had been walking her dog near the Johnsons' house when she noticed something strange. As she passed by, she saw a light flickering through the window of the basement. Margaret had been by the Johnsons' house hundreds of times and had never once seen that basement light on. Curious, she walked closer, squinting through the dark window. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. In the dim light, she made out the shape of a large object being moved around the basement. It was hard to make out what it was, but it was the manner in which it was moved that disturbed her. It seemed deliberate, slow and methodical, as though someone didn't want to be seen. Margaret's instincts told her something was terribly wrong. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to tell the police. That single observation would prove to be a turning point. The police arrived at the Johnsons' house the next morning, intent on searching the basement. They had already conducted multiple searches of the property, but had found nothing unusual until, As they entered the house and descended the stairs into the basement, they were hit by a strange, musty smell. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and discarded household items. But at the far end of the room, something was different. The space behind a stack of old furniture appeared recently disturbed, as though someone had been moving things around. The officers carefully moved the debris aside, revealing a small, hidden door that led to an even smaller room tucked away from sight. The door was locked, but with the help of a crowbar, they pried it open. Inside, they found a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, except for one chilling detail. The walls were covered in stains. The floor was uneven, as though it had been recently disturbed. And most disturbing of all, the small room contained a large sealed plastic bag. As the officers approached the bag, their hearts sank. It was Lily's backpack, the one she'd been carrying when she disappeared. The backpack, which had been buried beneath a pile of dirty old clothes, was still intact. But it was clear from the way it had been discarded that it had been hidden with the intention of not being found. It was the first concrete evidence they had that Lily hadn't just wandered off. Someone had hidden her, someone who had been trying to cover their tracks. But there was still no sign of Lily herself. The room, though strange and unsettling, revealed no other clues. There were no traces of her body, no obvious signs of a struggle, but the very fact that the room existed at all suggested that something sinister had been going on in that house for a long time. As the police dug deeper into the Johnsons' life, they discovered that Clara and Harold had kept to themselves even more than the community had realized. Clara's behavior, in particular, was erratic in the weeks before Lily's disappearance. Neighbors remembered seeing her pacing around the house at odd hours, her eyes wide, with an almost paranoid intensity. Harold had been similarly withdrawn, his interactions with others growing colder and more distant. People who had known the couple for years began to wonder if they had been hiding something from the very beginning. The discovery of the hidden room in the basement forced the investigation to take a darker turn. The police began to suspect that Lily's disappearance wasn't an accident, but something far more calculated. The question that lingered was not where Lily was, but why she had been hidden away in the first place, and whether she had been alive when she was locked away in that tiny, suffocating space. The walls of Ashwood, once so familiar and comforting, began to close in on everyone. The Johnsons were no longer seen as the ideal family, but as people with something to hide. And as the investigation continued, the truth, however horrifying it might be, was beginning to unravel. The discovery of the hidden room in the Johnsons' basement sent shockwaves through the small town of Ashwood. The police were now convinced that Lily's disappearance was not the result of an innocent accident. The evidence was mounting that something far darker was at play, and it was becoming clear that the Johnsons' carefully constructed facade of normalcy was just that, an illusion. For the first time since Lily had vanished, the police obtained a search warrant for the entire house. They were determined to find out what had happened to the little girl, and what they uncovered in the coming days would unravel the dark, twisted secrets of the Johnson family. It wasn't just the hidden room they had to investigate. The house itself was a kind of prison, a monument to years of secrets kept behind closed doors. The first breakthrough came when they uncovered Clara's journals. These weren't ordinary diaries, but a chilling documentation of her thoughts, her struggles, and increasingly, her delusions. As the police flipped through the pages, they were horrified to read about Clara's growing obsession with control, her fantasies of perfection, and, most disturbingly, her resentment toward her daughter. Clara's entries, written in a frantic, almost manic hand, spoke of Lily in ways that were deeply unsettling. Clara wrote about how she felt trapped by motherhood, how Lily had become a burden she could no longer bear. "She's a reflection of everything I've failed to achieve," one entry read. "She's weak, and I can't stand it. I have to fix her." The entries were a disturbing insight into a mind unraveling, and it was clear that Clara saw Lily not as a child to be loved, but as a project, something that could be molded into perfection. As the search continued, the police found more pieces to the puzzle. Hidden among stacks of old newspapers in a closet, they discovered photographs, photos of Lily at various stages of her life, but they weren't the loving family snapshots one might expect. Many of them were of Lily alone, taken at odd angles, as though someone had been watching her without her knowing. There were no pictures of her laughing, no pictures of the little girl playing with friends or enjoying a family outing. These were photos of a child who appeared lonely, isolated, and there was something off about her expression in many of them, a look of fear or confusion. The more the police uncovered, the more they began to piece together the horrifying truth. Clara's behavior had escalated in the months leading up to Lily's disappearance. Neighbors recalled seeing Clara's nervous breakdowns, her sudden outbursts, and the way she would shut herself in the house for days on end. Harold, for his part, had seemed increasingly distant, but he had always kept up the appearance of the dutiful husband. What they didn't know was that while Harold might not have been the one to carry out the abuse, he was fully aware of it and had done nothing to stop it. The physical evidence confirmed what the journals had hinted at. The autopsy on Lily's body, which had been hidden beneath the floorboards of the secret room, revealed the horrifying extent of the abuse. Lily had been starved, beaten, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Her small body bore the marks of weeks, possibly months, of neglect. There were broken bones, bruises, and burns that could only have been inflicted by someone with a complete disregard for her safety and well-being. But perhaps the most chilling detail was that the little girl had died not from an immediate violent blow, but from a slow, prolonged process of torment. Her death had been the culmination of months, if not years, of abuse, both physical and emotional. The investigation took a dark turn when the police uncovered traces of poison in Lily's system. It seemed that Clara had been slowly poisoning her daughter over time, perhaps as a twisted form of control. The chemicals found in Lily's bloodstream had been introduced gradually, likely in her food or drink, weakening her over time until it was too late. As the pieces of the case fell into place, the town of Ashwood was left reeling from the revelation of just how far the Johnsons had gone to keep their secret hidden. The perfect family, the ones who had seemed so ordinary, had been hiding a nightmare inside their walls. But the most shocking part of the discovery was that Lily had not died immediately. She had lived through the abuse, suffering for far longer than anyone could have imagined. She had been locked away in that small, hidden room, where she had suffered in silence, waiting for a rescue that never came. Harold and Clara were arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse and murder. The community, which had once trusted and admired the Johnsons, was left stunned by the truth. How could the quiet, perfect family they had known be capable of such evil? But as the trial loomed, it became clear that the true horror of Lily's suffering was something the town would never fully comprehend. The town of Ashwood would never be the same again, and neither would anyone who learned the terrible truth of what had happened behind the Johnsons' closed doors. The arrest of Harold and Clara Johnson rocked Ashwood to its core. The once quiet town was now at the center of a nightmare, and nothing would ever be the same again. The community had always seen the Johnsons as pillars of the town, hard-working, reliable, and kind. But the truth of what had been happening behind the walls of their home sent a ripple of disbelief through Ashwood. How could such a thing happen here? How could these two seemingly ordinary people, who had lived among them for years, have hidden such a monstrous secret? The trial was a spectacle. People from all over the town, as well as the surrounding areas, crowded into the courthouse, eager to hear the details of the case. News outlets descended on Ashwood, turning the small town into a media frenzy. For many, this was a story of horror and justice, a case of evil lurking in the most unexpected places. For others, It was the end of their illusion of safety. The quiet, comforting town they had once known seemed to be forever tarnished by the truth. Clara, once the picture of motherhood, had become a broken woman in the face of the charges. During the trial, she was a shadow of the confident, composed woman she had once appeared to be. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now hollow, empty. She had no defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The journals, the photographs, the autopsy. They all painted a picture of a woman consumed by a twisted need for control. In her defense, her lawyer argued that Clara's actions were the result of a mental illness. They pointed to her documented history of depression and anxiety, suggesting that her inability to care for Lily had been exacerbated by an untreated psychological condition. But this argument, while offering some insight into Clara's mindset, did little to soften the severity of her crimes. The abuse had been systematic, deliberate, and cold-hearted. She had locked her daughter away, starved her, poisoned her, and tortured her in ways that were impossible to justify, even with mental illness as an explanation. Harold, on the other hand, showed no remorse during the trial. He sat stone-faced, as if detached from the gravity of the charges against him. His role in the abuse, while less direct than Clara's, was undeniable. He had known what was happening. He had seen the bruises, heard the screams, and yet he had done nothing to stop it. His silence was a crime in itself. He was complicit in his daughter's suffering by his inaction, his failure to protect her when he had every opportunity to do so. As the prosecution laid out their case, the town of Ashwood was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that Lily's death wasn't a freak accident. It wasn't a case of a child running away and getting lost. It was the culmination of years of abuse hidden in plain sight, in a house that had once seemed so ordinary. The townspeople, once so eager to accept the Johnsons' facade, now had to grapple with the horrific truth that the family they had trusted had been living a lie. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when the verdict finally came, it was as expected. Clara was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as multiple counts of child abuse, while Harold was convicted of child neglect and accessory to murder. Clara was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harold received a sentence of 25 years to life. Both would live out their days behind bars, but for many no punishment would be enough to atone for the suffering they had caused Lily. In the weeks that followed the trial, Ashwood slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the scars of what had happened would never fade. The town's residents went on with their lives, but they would never again look at their neighbours the same way. The Johnsons' home, once a symbol of suburban perfection, was left abandoned, the windows boarded up and the door locked tight, as though trying to keep the past from escaping. It became a sad reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Lily Johnson's name became synonymous with tragedy. She was the child that no one had seen coming, the victim of a dark and twisted secret that had been buried in the most unlikely of places. In the wake of her death, Ashwood would forever be changed. People began to question what they truly knew about the families around them, about the neighbours they had long trusted. The case became a grim reminder that sometimes the worst things happen not in the shadows, but in the places we least expect, hidden behind the facade of normalcy, in homes that seem too perfect to be real.